Let me tell you something that happened to a friend of mine. At some point, the story splits, not into two versions people are arguing about, but into two versions that both exist in writing. On one side, there is what was claimed. On the other, there is what was recorded. And those two things are not always the same. In the court filings, the language becomes more specific. It describes behavior. It describes patterns. It describes concern. It connects moments together and presents them as part of something larger. That is what filings are designed to do. They take individual events and organize them into a narrative. They answer the question, what does this mean? But the police report answers a different question. It answers, what happened? And those are not the same question. The police report documents an event. It documents what was observed, what was said, what was done. It includes classifications. It includes outcomes. In this case, the report was marked completed. And prosecution was declined. That is part of the record. It is not interpretation. It is not argument. It is the outcome recorded at the time. But when that same situation appears in a court filing, it is no longer just documentation. It becomes description, and the description can extend beyond the boundaries of the original report. It can include language about patterns. It can include statements about mental health. It can include assertions about risk. And once those things are written, they become part of the official narrative. So now there are two things in the record: a report that documents an event and its outcome, and a filing that describes what that event represents. And when those two things are placed next to each other, the difference between them matters, because one shows what happened in that moment. The other shows how that moment is being interpreted later. And when those interpretations expand, they start to influence everything that follows. That is where the shift happens. Not in the original report, not in the filing alone, in the space between them. Because that space is where decisions begin to form. That space is where the story stops being only about a single event and starts being about a broader concern. And once that broader concern is written into the record, it carries forward. It shows up in later documents. It influences later actions. It becomes part of how the situation is understood moving forward. So now the question is not simply, what happened? It becomes, what version of what happened is being relied on? Because both exist, both are documented, both can be referenced, and both lead to very different conclusions. Let me tell you something that happened to a friend of mine. Before anything happened, there was already a structure. There was already an order, a court-defined framework for how parenting time worked. It defined expectations. It defined communication. It defined access. That's important because when something is already structured, you don't start from confusion. You start from clarity. You start from something both sides are supposed to follow. And that's where this begins. Not with conflict, with structure. The order existed. Parenting time was defined. Communication was expected to be consistent. Both parents were expected to cooperate. That's what the document says. And when something is written into a court order, it's not a suggestion. It's the standard. So at that point, everything should have been predictable. Not perfect, but predictable. There should have been a rhythm. There should have been consistency. There should have been communication that aligned with what the order already established. But that's not what started to happen. Instead, something shifted, not all at once, not with a single document, not with a single moment. It shifted through communication, through the way calls were handled, through the way time was coordinated, through the way requests were responded to. That's where you start to see it, in the messages, requests for calls, requests for timing, requests for confirmation, requests that should have had clear, consistent answers, based on the structure that already existed. But the responses didn't always create that clarity. Calls were delayed, calls were rescheduled, calls didn't always happen when expected, and sometimes the communication didn't resolve the request at all. Now, on its own, that doesn't sound extreme. People get busy, schedules change, things come up. That happens. But this isn't about one missed call or one delayed response. This is about a pattern that starts forming over time. And that's what matters, because when something happens once, it's an exception. When it happens repeatedly, it becomes the reality. And over time, the reality started to look different than the order. That's the point. The order didn't change, but the execution did. The expectations didn't change, but the consistency did. And when that happens, a gap forms. A gap between what is written and what is actually happening. And that gap is where everything else begins to build. Because once communication stops aligning with the structure, everything becomes harder to stabilize. You can't rely on timing. You can't rely on consistency. You can't rely on the framework the same way you could before. And when that happens, something subtle starts to change. The order still exists, but the experience doesn't match it anymore. And when the experience doesn't match the order becomes less effective in real life. Not legally, practically. And that's where this becomes important. Because parenting time is not just a schedule. It's a relationship. It's consistency for a child. It's the ability to maintain connection. And when that consistency starts to break, it doesn't just stay in the messages. It affects everything. So now there are two versions of the same situation. The one defined by the court and the one happening in real time. And those two versions don't match. And when they don't match, something has already changed. Even if no one has said it out loud yet, even if no one has formally acknowledged it. Because once the pattern shifts, it doesn't go back on its own. And that's what happened here. The structure was still there, but the consistency wasn't. The order still existed, but the experience didn't match it. And once that gap forms, everything that comes after it has to be understood in that context, because that's where the next part of the story begins. Let me tell you something that happened to a friend of mine. At some point, the story started to shift again. Not through reports this time, not through communication, through something else, an evaluation. And when an evaluation enters the record, everything changes. Because now it's not just about events. It's about interpretation of a person. It's about whether there is a condition, whether there is a pattern, whether there is something ongoing that affects behavior. And that carries a different kind of weight. Because once mental health becomes part of the conversation, it changes how everything else is viewed. So the evaluation matters. Not what people think it says, not what people assume it says, what it actually says. Because this is where clarity is supposed to exist. An evaluation is supposed to answer questions. It's supposed to assess. It's supposed to provide a professional determination based on what is observed. So when that document is created, it becomes one of the most important pieces of the record. And in this case, the evaluation described him as being of sound mind. It did not conclude that he was chronically mentally ill. That matters, because earlier in the process, the narrative had already started to move in a different direction. There were statements about behavior, there were concerns being raised, there were descriptions that suggested something broader than a single incident, something ongoing, something that extended beyond a moment. And once that kind of language is introduced, it starts to shape how everything else is interpreted, but the evaluation itself does not confirm that. And that creates another gap. Because now there are two things again, a narrative that suggests mental health concerns and an evaluation that does not establish a chronic condition. Both are in the record. Both exist. But they don't say the same thing. And that difference matters more than almost anything else in the entire story. Because once mental health becomes part of a case, it carries consequences. It affects credibility. It affects perception. It affects how future actions are justified. And if that framing is not supported in the same way across documents, then the framing itself becomes something that has to be examined. Not emotionally, not defensively, logically. Because the evaluation is supposed to ground the conversation. It's supposed to clarify what is actually present. And when that clarity doesn't match the narrative that has been building, you don't ignore that difference. You document it, you recognize it, because both things exist at the same time. The narrative continues, the evaluation stands on its own, and they don't fully align. And when they don't align, that difference doesn't disappear. It becomes part of the record. And once it becomes part of the record, it carries forward into everything that comes next. Because now the question isn't just what people said, it's what can actually be supported. And that's where this part of the story becomes critical. Because from this point forward, every claim has to be viewed alongside that evaluation. Every statement has to be compared to what was actually determined, and every conclusion has to be measured against what was documented. Because if those things don't match, the difference matters, and that difference doesn't stay isolated. It shows up again, in communication, in actions, in the way the situation continues to unfold, and that's exactly what happened. Let me tell you something that happened to a friend of mine. Even after everything, the communication never stabilized. That's not a single moment. That's a pattern, and patterns are what define outcomes, not isolated events. Not one conversation. Patterns. Because communication is where everything actually plays out. It's where parenting time becomes real. It's where coordination happens. It's where consistency either exists or doesn't. And in this case, it didn't. Requests were made repeatedly for calls, for times, for availability, for confirmation. Those requests weren't random. They were attempts to create structure, to align with what already existed in the court order, to bring consistency back into something that had started to shift. But the responses didn't always create that consistency. Sometimes there was a response, sometimes there wasn't. Sometimes there was a delay, sometimes there was a change, and sometimes the response didn't resolve the request at all. And over time, that becomes something else. It becomes unpredictability. And unpredictability changes everything. Because when communication is unpredictable, nothing else can stabilize. You can't plan, you can't rely on timing, you can't maintain consistency. And consistency is the foundation of everything in a co-parenting situation. So when that breaks down, everything else becomes harder. Not impossible, but harder. And when that happens alongside everything else in this story, it becomes even more significant. Because now it's not just about documents. It's about how those documents are affecting real interactions. The court order still exists, the expectations still exist, but the execution doesn't match. And when execution doesn't match expectation, the gap widens, and that gap becomes a reality. So now the story is no longer just about what was written. It's about what was happening. And what was happening was not stable. It was shifting. It was inconsistent. It was unresolved. And that matters. Because consistency is what allows everything else to function. And without it, everything becomes harder to maintain. So by this point, the pattern is clear. Not through assumption, through repetition. And once a pattern becomes clear, it doesn't need to be explained. It just needs to be recognized, because what repeats defines what is real. Let me tell you something that happened to a friend of mine. At this point, the story is no longer about a single event. It's not about one report. It's not about one filing. It's not about one conversation. It's about a pattern. And patterns don't come from one document. They come from all of them. When you step back and look at everything together, the reports, the filings, the evaluation, the communication, the requests, the responses, you start to see something, not because someone told you what to see, because it's there. A sequence, a progression, a pattern that forms over time. First, a report is created, a classification is assigned. Then the case is marked completed, prosecution is declined, then another report appears with a different classification. Then filings are made with expanded language. Then a safety plan is referenced without being shown. Then questions are asked without being answered. Then another report appears with a mental health classification. Then an evaluation is conducted that does not confirm a chronic condition. Then communication becomes inconsistent and stays that way. That is the pattern. Not one moment, a sequence. And the sequence matters because each step builds on the last. Each document doesn't exist alone. It sits next to everything else. And when you look at all of them together, the story becomes clearer. Not simpler, clearer. Because clarity doesn't come from one document. It comes from the relationship between them. What aligns, what doesn't, what is supported, what isn't, and what was never answered. That's the part people miss. It's not just what exists, it's what doesn't. The report that was referenced but not produced. The order that was implied but not shown. the safety plan that was treated as real but not documented, the questions that were asked but not answered. Those absences matter just as much as the documents themselves, because they shape the story. They define what can be verified. They define what remains unclear. And by this point, the question has changed completely. It's no longer what happened. It's what can actually be proven. What exists in writing? What was documented at the time? What was added later? What was supported? What wasn't? Because in the end, that's all that matters. Not interpretation, not assumption, the record. And when you look at the record, you don't see one clean narrative. You see multiple layers. You see multiple classifications. You see multiple descriptions. You see multiple unanswered questions, all existing at the same time. And that's what defines this part of the story, not a conclusion, a pattern. Because once you see the pattern, you don't need someone to explain it to you. You just need to recognize it. And once you recognize it, you understand what happened in a completely different way. And that's where this part of the story ends.